Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just letting everybody in. Thank you for joining us for your lunch hour today. We have a great opportunity here. This is a wonderful way for us to end our 2024 live webinar series. So we are very grateful to our speakers today for joining us. If you can see the screen, you'll see that you are here for understanding and responding to problem gambling among college students, unique risks and innovative solutions. You are in the right place. We have a great panel of speakers here for you, all from UAlbany. And they're going to come in and introduce themselves and give you an overview and get right to the training today. We have a lot to cover. Just a few reminders, excuse me. In order for you to receive your credits, we are offering OASIS and social work credits today for this presentation. You will have to go back into your training center platform and complete the post survey evaluation. Once you complete that, your certificate will automatically generate into your locker. You just go to that tab and you can download, save, print, whatever you need to do for your certificate. If you do have any issues, you can email the email on the bottom, and that will come directly to me, and I'm happy to assist. Throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to add them into the chat. We'll have time for some questions at the end. And, overall, for those of you who have come all year long, thank you for joining us again for all of our webinars in 2024. We have some great ones coming up in 2025, so stay tuned. And with that, I'm going to hand it over.
Thank you so much, Diana, for all your support through the planning process, and welcome everyone to our webinar addressing collegiate gambling. So my name is Dr. Dolores Cimini. I'm a licensed psychologist and director of the Center for Behavioral Health Promotion and Applied Research. In a moment, I will open the webinar up to my colleagues to introduce themselves, but I'd like to first briefly talk with you about our learning objectives for today. Today, our hope is to talk with you about the data and the landscape of gambling among college students, as well as looking at comorbid mental health and substance use concerns that may arise. In addition to that, we're going to be going over some screening tools that have been found to be useful and effective with college students, and also how to recruit and screen college students for gambling. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about prevention navigation as a very promising strategy to address collegiate gambling. We are very honored to have one of our student navigators with us who will be presenting that part of the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Dr. Jessica Martin to introduce herself, and then we'll proceed with the webinar. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dolores. My name is Dr. Jessica Martin. I'm the Associate Director for the Center for Behavioral Health Promotion and Applied Research, and also a Senior Research Associate with the Research Foundation for SUNY. So to get us started, I want to talk about the definition of problem gambling and the scope of the problem. So this might be repetitive for some of you who are more familiar with gambling and gambling research, but I wanted to go over a definition of gambling and just briefly touch on some of the different types of gambling that exist. So gambling is any activity that involves placing something of value at risk in the hopes of gaining something of greater value. And that image in the center shows some more common types of gambling, such as horse racing, especially here in Saratoga Springs area, located nearby the university, lottery games, of course, video lottery, internet gambling, and sports wagering, which are hugely popular right now, especially among college students. And then to the right, you see three different emerging types of gambling. So there's retail investing, which is non-professional investing of small amounts of money in lower price per share stocks. Cryptocurrency, it's a highly chance-based volatile investment market using platforms like Robinhood and Coinbase. and NFTs, which are digital assets such as art, gifts, tweets, and more sold through blockchain currency. So changes in gambling types and prevalence over the years. There's been a rise of gambling across the nation. In the early 2000s, gambling was predominantly in person, in casinos, and through state lotteries. And then in the mid 2000s, we saw a rapid increase in online poker and casino games. And then by 2018, the US Supreme Court granted states the right to legalize and regulate online sports betting. Before that, sports betting was illegal under federal law. So currently, gambling is legal in 48 states with the exception of Utah and Hawaii. And there is live and legal sports betting in at least 38 states plus Washington, D.C. In 2021, about 24% of Americans participated in sports betting and 12% placed bets weekly. About 75% of college students across the nation have gambled in the last year. And estimates suggest that about 6 to 10% of college students meet criteria in the DSM for gambling disorder. And our own data, in fact, suggest at the University of Albany that our student population, about 6% of our student population is also meeting criteria. So very consistent with national data. So this percentage of folks meeting criteria for gambling disorder is about 3 to 5 times higher than documented rates in the adult population. So you can see that college students are particularly an at-risk group for problem gambling. So next I want to define or take a look at some of the factors associated with gambling among college students. So age, college students between the ages of 18 and 25 are at higher risk for problematic substance use, risky sexual behaviors, and also gambling disorder. Availability is a factor. So this is the first generation of college students to be exposed to wide-scale legal gambling. Technological advances make placing bets extremely easy. It's right on the phone, and any of you that know college students know that a phone is always in their hand. So the convenience of mobile sports betting apps such as FanDuel and DraftKings give people 24/7 access. Acceptability. Gambling is seen as very acceptable. So it's operated by governments. It's commonly endorsed by schools, by sports team. It's very much integrated into mainstream culture. More than ever, we see the media promoting and advertising gambling. So, it's glamorized among sports stars, which creates a winning bias. There's also predatory advertising. So there's a constant barrage of ads that glamorize and normalize gambling for college students. Access to cash. So we tend to think about college students as having less access to cash than many, which is often the case. However, we do also know that college students receive about 25 credit card solicitations per semester. So they do end up having, and of course they do end up having access to credit cards, not necessarily cash. And that is what's needed to place online bets. And then fear of missing out. College students are enticed with offers to bet all the time. They very much perceive gambling, and especially online gambling, to be normative behavior. And many see it as a chance to sort of beat the bank, right? It's an opportunity to make money. Right. Switching now to problem gambling and what factors are associated with it and what tends to be comorbid with problem gambling. So problem gambling, also referred to as gambling addiction or gambling disorder, is gambling behavior that's damaging to a person or their family, and often disrupts their daily life or their career. Excuse me. People interacting with a person experiencing problem gambling may notice changes in their mood or behaviors. sometimes including symptoms of depression and often including withdrawal from family or friends. Other signs and symptoms include unexplained debt, requests to borrow money, and a preoccupation with gambling may be observed. Among the college students that we work with, some report a drop in grades and using financial aid money or other college loans to engage in gambling activities. People experiencing problem gambling often report lying about their gambling. They feel compelled to chase losses, and they report unsuccessful attempts to cut back or to stop gambling. There's a number of risk factors associated with problem gambling, and I'll review here several that are particularly relevant for young adults and college students. Adverse childhood experiences are strongly linked with gambling outcomes. In a study conducted in 2015, those who reported childhood trauma experienced 40 to 100% increased risk for gambling disorder. Gambling as a means to cope is found to moderate the relationship between stressful life events and problem gambling, meaning that it makes those who experienced stressful life events and who gamble to cope with those stressful life events more likely to experience gambling-related problems. Attitudes towards sports gambling is the most significant predictor of college students' sports gambling behavior. The desire to gain money is a primary motivator among college students. And students with positive attitudes towards gambling as an income generator are at higher risk than those who report other reasons for gambling to eventually meet criteria for problem gambling. An early study by Wickweir and colleagues reported that 92% of students surveyed agreed that gambling makes people look smart, and 90% agreed that gambling solves financial problems. So you can see what the normative attitudes here are around gambling among college students. The motivation to comply with others' behaviors, especially behavior perceived as the norm. I think that someone might have their mic on.
Just because I'm starting to work with our communication.
The motivation to comply with others' behavior, especially behavior perceived as the norm, is also a strong predictor of gambling behaviors. So students are more likely to engage in gambling activities if their parents or peers engage in or endorse gambling activities. Sports betting, a particular type of gambling, poses additional risks. Sports bettors are twice as likely to become problem gamblers than non-sports bettors. Estimates suggest that about 29%, so almost a third of sports gamblers experience gambling problems or meet criteria for a gambling disorder. Pathological gamblers or problem gamblers are more likely to bet on sports than any other gambling activity. Among college students specifically, a higher level of involvement in fantasy sports is significantly related to the likelihood and frequency of gambling. Many sports bettors tend to perceive that their wages on gambling on games are safer and more informed by their expertise and skill than by luck, and therefore they perceive that they have more control over the outcome of their bet. This is also known as the false illusion of control. Live betting or in-play betting, such as placing bets on certain plays during a game, on scores for a particular quarter, or even on certain plays made by certain players, reduces the delay between placing the bet or the risk and the potential for reward or cashing in on the bet. A 2020 study found that live betting increased betting opportunities and motivated loss chasing, resulting in persistent and extended betting sessions. Those engaging in live betting also had higher gambling severity scores than those who didn't engage in live betting. Problem gambling is associated with a number of other mental health disorders and addictive behaviors. So it's important to note that of all the addictive behaviors, gambling is associated with the highest risk for suicide attempts. A meta-analysis of suicidality among individuals with gambling problems that included 107 published studies was published in 2024, and it reported that the average prevalence rate of suicidal ideation among those with gambling disorder reported across all those studies was 31.6%, and the average prevalent rate of suicide attempts is 13.2%. A systematic review of gambling-related suicides published in 2022 found that the two main processes connecting gambling and suicide behavior documented in the literature are indebtedness and shame. And those two factors also make it less likely that folks will seek help. There are several types of factors that can contribute to the occurrence of gambling disorder with other mental health issues and addictions. Shared risk factors like genetic predispositions, environmental influences, and personality traits like impulsivity and sensation seeking can predispose individuals to multiple mental health disorders and addictive behaviors. Some people may use gambling as a way to cope with emotional distress, leading to or even exacerbating existing mental health conditions. And neurobiological factors, such as changes in brain chemistry and structure, particularly related to the reward system in the brain, can underlie both gambling disorder and other addictions and mental health concerns. Problem gambling is associated with a host of negative consequences for college students, including increased substance use and mental health concerns, including, as we just mentioned and discussed, suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. College students also report strained relationships with family and friends and social isolation, often as a result of withdrawing from activities and events that they once enjoyed. Students experience problem gambling are more likely to report unmanageable debt, failing grades, and lower GPA. And at this point, I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Longo to discuss gambling-related findings from the data that we collected at UAlbany in spring of this year.
Great, thank you so much. So I'll start by sharing just a little bit more about what that survey is. So each year we conduct a health and well-being survey. It's we share it to both undergraduate and graduate students. So for undergraduate students, we have a random stratified sample of students, meaning that we are meeting students across different years in school, different majors, and we are really trying to tap into a representative sample based on the demographics of our school. And the way that our graduate students are invited to the study is through a random sample, and we reach out to those students through email. It's also important to note that we conduct this study between mid-February and mid-March, specifically before students go on spring break, so that we're not capturing heightened or more risky behaviors. We're really trying to capture more of like what the baseline looks like outside of times when we know that students are more likely to engage in higher risk behavior. In addition to gambling behaviors, we also examine substance use, so whether that be alcohol, cannabis, tobacco, whatever that might be, sexual health behaviors, and so on. So from the data that I'll be sharing today was collected in spring of 24, so last spring semester. We had just under 1,500 students complete the survey. And I will describe a few different graphs that are up on the screen. The first talks about the year in school. There are two different bars here, and I'm going to describe the light blue bars, and I'll give rough estimates here. So about 30% of our sample were first-year students, around 20% were sophomores and juniors, followed by 15% graduate students, and roughly 10% were seniors. The mean age in our sample was just over 22 years old. Our sample was about 55% female, 40% male, and I think around 1 or 2% who were transgender or another gender.
Become a cliche, a trope that if we were just focused on.
Thank you for muting that. And with regards to race, about 40% of our sample identifies as white, around 20% bi or multiracial, followed by just under 20% identify as Black, and around 15% identify as Asian. And in terms of sexuality, just under 80% identify as heterosexual, and around 20% are identify as queer. So with regards to gambling behavior specifically, just about 46% had reported gambling within the last year. And of those students who gamble, about 10% had scored in the at-risk or in high risk on the South Oaks gambling scale, which is a scale that we are going to cover a little bit more in depth in a few slides, but it is a scale that is screening for problem gambling. So to reiterate, around 46% say that they had gambled in the last year, and about 10% of those who did gamble were either at risk or at high risk for problem gambling. We also wanted to know a little bit more about what types of gambling students were engaging in. With the most frequent type of gambling behavior reported, around 32% were bets with friends. 27% purchased lottery tickets, around 20% reported betting on sports. And then finally, around 14% reported gambling with playing cards or online bets. I'll note here that these different categories aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. So you could see that perhaps someone can both engage in online betting and then sports betting. And so this is something that we had realized when we were really taking a closer look at our data. And we have changed how we are capturing this type of information moving forward so that we could be more specific and more clear on what types of behaviors specifically students are engaging in. Part of that survey, like I had mentioned, is also partially a screener for problem gambling. And using that, we saw that the most frequently reported problem included chasing losses, with about 22% of students who gambled having reported chasing losses in the last year. And this was above and beyond the most frequently reported problem. After that, we dropped down to about 9% of folks who gambled who said that they felt bad about about the amount that they bet or what happens when betting. Also, those who said about 9% reported gambling more than they had planned. Around 7% said that they had lied about winning, and around 4% said that they had been criticized or told that they had a gambling problem. So on the first slide that I had presented, we looked at a lot of demographics, and I had just shared those who were in the sample, but there was another bar on there who also that corresponded with so there was our total sample, and then specifically those people who reported gambling in the last year. And beyond just looking at the differences visually, we wanted to know if there were statistically meaningful differences in the students who had gambled in the last year versus those who did not report gambling in the last year. And from those findings, we were able to see that people who had gambled were significantly more likely to be male. They were more likely to be white. They were more likely to be fraternity or sorority members in comparison to students who were not part of Greek life. And they were also more likely to be students in our Educational and Opportunities program. That is what the EOP stands for. And our EOP program specifically serves students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And so that means that those students who are more economically advantaged were significantly more likely to report in gambling than those who were not. Which makes a lot of sense when we think about what some of those risk factors for problem gambling are. We also wanted to know if there were differences in their behaviors, students who gambled versus those who did not gamble in the last year. And our findings indicated that students who gambled were more likely to report using tobacco and had more frequent use of vaping or using e-cigarettes. They also had more frequent use of alcohol, more frequent use of cannabis use. They are also significantly more likely to engage in heavy episodic or informally binge drinking in comparison to students who didn't gamble. And they also scored higher on other measures of risky substance use. So on both the audit, which measures risky alcohol use, and also the DAS, which measures other drug use. And so now I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Chimini, who opened us up, who is going to be discussing gambling screening tools.
Dolores, you're muted.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to be talking now about two particular screening tools that have been found to be effective in working with college students, and they are the South Oaks Gambling Screen Revised and the Rutgers Clinical Gambling Screen. The South Oaks Gambling Screen Revised is an update of the South Oaks Gambling Screen. The South Oaks Gambling Screen originally was comprised of 16 items, and it was primarily assessed on adults. It was tested on adults, and then there was a revised version consisting of 12 questions developed for adolescents and young adults, and that is the screening tool that is used with our college population. Now, before I proceed in talking about the Rutgers measure, I do want to mention that there are a couple of items that neither of these surveys represent, and they are the fact that college students in particular are uniquely at risk of using their financial aid dollars for gambling purposes. And also there are elements we want to assess around grades and around academic performance. And neither of these measures specifically address that. So those need to be added when doing a screening if you're interested in looking into those areas. So we talked about the SOGS-R, and in terms of the Rutgers gambling screen, that has three components, which I'll show you in a moment on the next slide. And this is the assessment that we are using currently at the University at Albany. We find it's both sensitive and specific in addressing college student gambling concerns. Specificity is the measure assessing what it's intended to measure, and then the sensitivity is how accurately is it doing that. So this is the first piece of the Rutgers measure, and if you look on the list here, it lists a number of different activities that comprise the general term gambling. Not once is the term gambling mentioned on this list. And that's important when working with college students, because if you ask them, are you gambling? Are you engaging in gambling? They're likely to say no. But if you ask in this way and you list specific activities and you ask about frequency of the different behaviors, you're likely to get more accurate data. Okay, so this is the first part, gambling activities. Now we go to the second part. And this is a biosocial screening measure. So the way this works is that if any item on the first piece, the gambling activities piece, is flagged as yes for any frequency, then the biobehavioral social measure is given. And that you can see is very short. It asks for 2 questions about the effects of gambling on the student. If there's a flag on any of those items, then we go to the third piece. There we go. And this is perceptions of gambling. And that helps us produce a risk area for each of the students. So as you can see, this can be done very briefly. If no one flags on gambling activities, you can stop there. But if they do, you can continue with each of the other pieces of the survey. So this is a very, very time efficient assessment measure, and this is what we use at our university. Next step. Next slide. All right, so so how do we engage our students, and how do we engage college students in general in gambling screening and also screening for comorbid mental health and substance use concern? Well, we do it in a number of ways because there's no one way to effectively reach college students on a campus. So I'll talk about some of these right now, and the screening in college mental health and health centers. If you work at a college or university, many of your health centers or counseling centers are routinely screening now for depression, anxiety, risk for suicide, and substance use. We recommend that gambling screens be added if time allows. It's really critical. Until we started asking about gambling, we really didn't. We weren't able to see it. And so in order for us to see it and to see the growing issues around gambling, we really need to ask students routinely. Another item, another way to assess for risk for gambling is mass online surveys. So Laura described that very thoroughly in the prior slides. We administer a survey to a random stratified sample of our students. So at that point, it's a survey. So students are providing prevalence data for us. But at the end of that survey, we ask a question: would you like to meet with a prevention navigator to discuss your survey results a little further? And we talk about the connection between well-being and academic success. You know, we put a little description in there. And if students say yes, then their information is requested in a separate survey, so it's kept very separate from their anonymous survey data, and we follow up with them with prevention navigators and discuss their results and do a brief intervention with them. In addition to that, the other way that we engage in screening is we go in classrooms. So we may give a presentation on gambling in a classroom, or mental health or substance use, or all three. We talk about well-being, and as part of that, we offer screenings and classes. We also go into classrooms on subjects that don't address mental health, substance use, or gambling: economics classes, business classes, and we get classes selected by our institutional research office. We reach out to the faculty members. We say, can we come in and do our survey? And most faculty members say, yes, absolutely. The survey is very short in terms of length. It takes about no more than 10 minutes. So that also is another way that we do that. In addition to that, we engage students in events and information tables. You see a photo here of one of our projects and how we engage students there. So we set up a private area away from this public table, and if a student wants to complete a screening, they go in that private area, they complete the screening, and can meet with a prevention navigator right there. One of the unique ways that we are engaging in assessment and screening of our students at the University at Albany is through prevention navigation. And prevention navigation involves engaging a peer with lived experience in either gambling, substance use, or mental health, or who represents the rich diversity on our campus, and placing them in areas on campus where students naturally congregate. So our student club areas, our advisement centers, our navigators are partnering, for example, with our Department of Psychology Advisement Center, and our students, our navigators are placed in that office. So when students come in for their to set up their schedules at the university for the semester, the advisor says, oh, we have a prevention navigator here. Would you like to take a few minutes to do a well-being check-in? This really would help support your success. And many students do say yes, and they can just walk over to the navigator who's right there in the next office. So that's also been very effective. It's an area where pretty much all students have to cross because they have to do schedules every semester. So that works as well. At this point, what I'd like to do is to pass the presentation on to Megan McCarthy, who is one of our prevention navigators, and she'll tell you more about how that works.
Thank you, Dolores. So yes, my name is Megan McCarthy. I'm a doctoral student at the University at Albany, and I'm a peer prevention navigator on the project. And I can walk you through what this actually looks like in practice in terms of what this intervention looks like. So Project Access is a project on campus that works to implement ESPER in college and university settings to address problem gambling and comorbid concerns. And one way that we do this is through this peer prevention navigation model. So the prevention navigation approach broadly is a strategy that uses trained peers with lived experience, like Dolores said, to guide students through accessing and utilizing prevention resources and supports. And consistent with the goals of ESPER, our overall goal is to prevent the onset of escalation of health issues by connecting students to prevention services, information, and support systems. And in appointments, navigators build rapport with students. They ask open-ended questions. They assess desire and readiness to change and deliver the consequent intervention depending on where a student is at in terms of their desire and readiness to change. And then they also connect and refer students to additional supports as relevant. So now I'm going to walk you through a case example of what this appointment might look like depending on a specific presenting concern. So all students who meet with the navigator complete our survey ahead of time, and the navigator then uses the student survey responses to populate our well-being worksheet, which is shown on the screen here. The image on the left of the screen has substance use risk zones that navigators can reference when reviewing student scores. And the image on the right of the screen is the bottom section of the worksheet and is filled out in real time with the student to represent their individual scores on their survey. In this example, student A is scoring a 10 on the audit, a 6 on the problem gambling severity index, which comes from that Rutgers gambling screening protocol that Dolores just walked us through, and a 9 on the PHQ-9, which measures symptoms of depression. You can also see that they're not reporting suicidal ideation, which is that item number 9 that's referenced on the bottom of the image. More specifically, student A is reporting drinking 2 to 3 times a week and binge drinking about once a week. Regarding gambling, student A is reporting betting more than they can afford to lose, chasing losses, and being told that their gambling is a problem by friends. And now, the question becomes, how might a navigator handle this scenario? So the navigator would start by building rapport with the student. The navigator might ask questions like, tell me about your studies in school, or how is your semester going so far? And they would then start asking open-ended questions, which are informed by that screening data we just showed on the previous slide. So the navigator might ask questions like, tell me about what your relationship with gambling looks like, or how does alcohol use fit into your life right now? Based on student A's responses, the navigator would then ask more open-ended questions to assess the desire and readiness to change. So a navigator might ask questions like, what are some of the not so good things about your gambling, to get a sense of if student A notices any negative consequences of their gambling. And that can sometimes indicate to the navigator that there might be some desire to change. The navigator would also assess student A's readiness to change. So they might use a skill like the readiness ruler and ask student A a question like, on a scale from 1 to 10, how ready are you to change your gambling right now? So now let's say a navigator has done all of that and they can sense that student A is pretty ambivalent about making a change. And I would say this is more common than not, that students are pretty ambivalent. So what would a navigator do in that circumstance? So a navigator would meet student A where they're at and engage them in a brief intervention using motivational interviewing and from a harm reduction perspective. A navigator would likely choose to focus on protective behavioral strategies that student A could implement to make their gambling safer. And this change can often feel more feasible to students as opposed to stopping the behavior altogether. So for example, a navigator would work collaboratively to discuss behavioral strategies with student A, such as setting predetermined amounts of money to be gambled or avoid chasing losses. Student A reported that that was a risk for them, or a risk behavior for them was that avoiding that they were chasing losses. So the navigator would work with the student to talk about that and maybe use an example of other forms of entertainment that cost money and compare gambling to that, of viewing the amount lost of engaging in gambling as just a cost of engaging in that behavior. A navigator might also choose to make connections between student A's gambling, alcohol use, and mental health. For example, a navigator might ask, how has gambling impacted your mental health? Which might increase student A's desire to change if they begin to make connections on the ways in which gambling is negatively impacting them. And a navigator could also ask if student A has noticed changes in their gambling when they're drinking while gambling, for example. And the goal of all of this is to help student A identify how their gambling, alcohol use, and mental health might be connected to one another, and that can then increase self-awareness and potentially foster that motivation to make a change. So with students like student A who are maybe more ambivalent to making a change, a navigator would walk them through our resource Rolodex, which you are welcome to check out by scanning the QR code on the screen here. And the Rolodex has a list of both on and off-campus resources, all of which are free or low cost to students. And the resources are also sorted by category. For example, we have a problem gambling category, which is shown in the picture on your screen here. And when students navigate this list of resources, they can click on any individual resource and learn more about information about what that resource offers. And they can also find a link to a website or a phone number to call. And the Rolodex is great for students who are more ambivalent to make a change because they can access it at any time in the future when maybe they're more ready. So the navigator is kind of planting that seed and getting them introduced to something like the Rolodex. And then maybe down the line, when they feel more ready to make a change, they can pull up this Rolodex again and find resources. If student A was more ready to make a change, you might take more of an active approach in the appointment when walking through the resources in the Rolodex, and you might even make phone calls to treatment resources with the student in the room while in the appointment. So what are the benefits to peer prevention navigation? Students appreciate meeting with a peer, which we can see in survey data that I'll walk you through in the next few slides. Also, screening and brief intervention captures risk behaviors that students may not realize that are coming up for them or present with on their own. And lastly, students are often surprised by their scores, and we view that knowledge is power. And if we can promote awareness about health behaviors, students can make more informed decisions in the behaviors they engage in. So as you can see, students positively experience navigation appointments. 92.2% feel comfortable and supported in the appointment, 94% feel heard and listened to, and 90.2% feel that they can talk about important issues with a navigator without judgment. Additionally, 75% say their navigation appointment will help them be happier and healthier. 75% also say their navigation appointment will help them do well in school. And 78.8% would recommend a project access navigation appointment to a friend. Lastly, students report being more comfortable talking to a peer navigator compared to a variety of other service providers. So 66% of students report feeling more comfortable talking to a navigator compared to a medical provider. 64.1% would feel more comfortable talking to a navigator as compared to a professor. 63.1% would prefer to talk with a navigator compared to a parent or guardian. And a little over half, or about 53.4% of students, even feel that they'd be more comfortable talking with a navigator compared to a therapist or a psychologist. So I think
Okay, yes, thank you, Megan. All right, thank you everyone for listening to our presentation. At this point, we wanted to allow some time for Q&A. And so I'm going to ask and encourage anyone who has questions to please communicate those questions. Diana, I don't know how you prefer to do that, whether you want people to unmute or do it through chat.
People can unmute if they would like. I'm just checking the chat. I have. So there is one question that I can answer. Yes, Kelsey, the slides are available in the training platform. You can log in and under the resource tab, under the title, you will see that the slides were there. So thank you to UAlbany staff for providing those for us. That's the only one currently. So if there are any questions, yeah, anybody can feel free to either
Hi, this is
put it in the chat
Susan.
or they can
Oh.
unmute.
Hi, this is Susan
Yep,
from
go right ahead, Susan.
Minnesota. And I was just curious, after the screenings that you conducted with your students, just an estimate, how many actually asked to see a navigator if they indicated that they were having some problems with their gambling?
Jess, I think you probably would know best what that number is.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this. I'm gonna say around 10 to 15%. Because we screened, as you saw, that particular semester about 1,400 students. I think we completed about between 130 and 140 navigation appointments that semester. So the other important point there too is that students are incentivized to complete surveys associated with the project, so that they had to complete a series of 3 surveys, and then they can receive $30. So they also need to complete a navigation appointment. So they complete the initial screener, a navigation appointment, and follow-up screeners. And if they do those things, they get $30. So I just think that's important to note that some are also incentivized to meet with navigators for that reason.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also important to note that most students who are screened, and we certainly have screened many, are not screened to be at risk for substance use, mental health concerns, or gambling.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and I would also say that those students who are at the least risk are often those who are most likely to attend an appointment. Right, so there, which I think intuitively makes sense. There's a lot less going on. Things are in order. There are absolutely students who are at risk who attend appointments, and also we are going to be taking a look at who cancels appointments and taking a look to see are they people who are at higher risk? Are they people who are more likely to screen positive on a screener, those who cancel? And if there's a way that we can predict cancellations, perhaps there's something that we could change in our protocol to actually meet those students. But something that we're actively working towards.
Great, thanks.
We did have another question pop up in the chat. Jennifer is asking, how do you recruit your navigators?
Okay, that's a good question. We primarily use graduate students, mostly doctoral students and some master's students in our counseling psychology training program. But certainly navigators don't need to exclusively be recruited that way. Prior to working on these projects, I ran a peer assistance program at the university, the Middle Earth program. There are so many ways to potentially recruit navigators, going to faculty members that we know and getting nominations from them and reaching out to the students saying, hey, your faculty member thinks that you would be able to do a great job on this. Let me tell you about this opportunity. Of course, ads at the university. So you're reaching out to students who may be interested through social media and other methods also has been effective. So there are a lot of ways to do this. The challenge is always keeping up with the communication methods that our students are engaging in, because that seems to be changing daily.
Yeah, and I'll add to that too, that in addition to counseling psychology, public health is also another department where we're getting student interest in, and have trained navigators who are from public health. And their training seems to have given them like a pretty wonderful background as a foundation. With that, the onboarding process is around, I would say, 11 to 12 weeks of training with supervision and building up all the skills. Megan mentioned a number of skills related to motivational interviewing and also SBIRT, screening, brief, intervention, referral to treatment. So the onboarding process is absolutely an investment. And once we train our students, we really love and do find that they often stay on with us.
We had a couple more questions pop up in the chat, so I'll read them and correct me if I'm reading them wrong. But do you get a sense from the general student population that they think online gambling, sports betting, etc., is a concern among their peers? I'm curious about the general perception of risk.
Meg, maybe you can speak to that in your role as peer navigator, and Meg also leads our peer advisory board, which where we've recruited undergraduate students who are interested in this topic area to help us out with giving us feedback on our approach, on our advertising materials. They often want to get involved in different aspects of the project, so curious what they think as well.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I would say in my experience, majority with in navigator appointments and in interacting with the peer advisory board of group of undergraduate students is most students do think that it is a concern among their peers and have a concern about the increase, especially in accessibility and the just general increase in this behavior. And how normalized they perceive it to be among their peers. So I would say it probably also depends on which students you're talking with, because as Laura mentioned, a lot of the students that tend to follow through with appointments that I would say I interact with on a more consistent basis are our lower risk students. And it's not surprising that those students then have perceptions of thinking that gambling and sports betting are a concern. But I would imagine that if we were interacting with students who were maybe higher risk and maybe engaging in gambling more often, they likely perceive that behavior as more normative. So I think it probably depends, but I would say on a more consistent basis, the students I'm interacting with do view it as a concern, but that it's important to mention that those are students who are already low risk. So that's, yeah, how I would answer that.
Thank you. The next question we have you had students who have been interviewed at the initial appointment and requested help because those questions tapped into issues they have been avoiding?
The answer is yes, absolutely. And that's the beauty of navigation, is that students can engage with fellow students who really are perceived as understanding them, listening to them. They feel safer to talk to. And so as a result, there have been many circumstances where in the midst of a navigation appointment, students have shared things that came to mind during the appointment that they've been struggling with. There was one situation, in fact, and this is not going to violate any confidentiality, but a student who was seeking mental health assistance formally and was engaged with a mental health provider and was at some level of risk for suicide when they met with one of our navigators, and the student revealed that to the navigator, but had not revealed it to the mental health professional who they had met with earlier that day. So of course, we helped make the connection and encourage the student then to let the mental health provider know. So we made that link for them. So there are many, many examples of navigators really being critically important in helping students identify and get support for issues. Meg, I don't know if there's anything you want to add because you're actually on the front lines with this.
Yeah, I would just echo that it's incredibly common. I would say it probably happens in almost all of my appointments that something comes up that a student wasn't expecting or something that they maybe hadn't thought about before. I think especially because our appointments, of course, we address problem gambling, substance use, mental health, but we leave it to be really broad as well. So each student feels comfortable bringing up anything that feels relevant to their health and well-being. So I think especially when we come at it through that broader lens of health and well-being being unique and individual to each student, there's almost always at least something that comes up in that conversation that a student maybe hasn't thought about before, or maybe has been avoiding, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I would say it's incredibly common and probably happens in definitely a majority of appointments.
And we also hear more and more about basic needs, students needing basic need like money, housing. There are students that have come to us that didn't have a home or were homeless, students with food insecurity. So we're able to link them to resources for those things. Students are coming into college campuses with more and more complex mental health, substance use, gambling, and basic needs. And so we're prepared as navigators to address that, and have been able to connect students with vital resources along the basic needs lines.
Thank you. We do have one more question, it looks like, in the chat. This one reads, wondering if you have any thoughts on the potential barrier to seeking help for student athletes in particular, for fear of disclosing that they have a gambling problem due to potential repercussions in their athletic career. Are they protected by HIPAA through the counseling center?
Well, in terms of protection, at our counseling center, there are licensed psychologists and licensed mental health counselors. The HIPAA process or HIPAA procedures are not part of our counseling center, and I believe not part of our health centers. The information, however, is protected because it is shared under the license of the mental health practitioner, and the information is not part of the academic record, and that is told to students at the very beginning of their contacts at the counseling center. And that students signed an informed consent, so that when we make sure that they understand that. Student athletes, that could be a whole presentation in itself, as a matter of fact, because last week I was part of a presentation addressing gambling and student athletes. And the student athlete environment is often a very, very closed system that offers its own challenges. And in the same way as there is stigma, there are challenges in terms of seeking treatment around mental health and substance use related concerns. There's a similar thing around gambling, and there are unique risks for student athletes around gambling. There are some now reports and articles and podcasts out there about student athletes being harassed because fans are betting on them, and if they're not performing athletically in a way that makes the bettors win, then the athletes get harassed over social media. I mean, it's a whole, this is a whole presentation, just giving you a quick summary here. But yes, this is something that is really on the rise. If we think about college students, we really need to pay attention to the athletics piece, as it's a really growing challenge and issue for us as practitioners.
Dolores, I'll add just one more bit to that because I know that we're very close to time, but I think this is also a matter of policy. And I know that on our campus, we have a policy called Safe Harbors, so that if there are student athletes, they're able to essentially seek support. And I know that the policy is for substance use disorder. And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not positive if it does include gambling disorder.
I don't think it does yet, Laura, but I'm sure they're thinking about it. You're referring to the Good Samaritan policy,
I
right?
think Safe Harbor is
Huh.
specific to student athletes in particular.
Okay.
So that they don't lose their varsity status if they are using substances, which they're not, it's against their contract to do that. But that is a way that students are able to seek mental health support to address substance use disorder. However, the timing of that, so if a student comes forward and says, I have an issue that I want to work through, they are in quote safe harbor. But I think the policy is if you don't come forward to seek support, that they are not protected, and then their varsity status could be jeopardized. So again, I think that's for substance use disorders in particular, and I'm not sure if it includes gambling yet.
Yeah, it probably will. Yeah, it seems like a variation of the Good Samaritan policy on our
Mhm.
campus too. But it
Mhm.
is a unique policy, and it's great that we have it. So thanks for sharing that.
Awesome. That looks like all the questions in the chat we got covered. If anybody does have more questions, you can send them over to the training center, and I'm sure we can send them over to get answered. I just want to thank the UAlbany staff for presenting. I think you piqued our interest with that student athlete, summary. So we might, be looking forward to something on that in 2025. For those of you still here, I am just going to share again the instructions to get your certificate. Just be sure to log into your training center, complete the post test and the course evaluation. Your certificate will pop up. If you have any issues with that, you can reach out to the training center for support. And, we look forward to, continuing to learn together in 2025. So thank you for being here with us on our last webinar of 2024. And a couple in the chat just to thank you. Great presentations coming up. So
Thank you, everyone.
yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Of course, thank you for the work you do. This was really very interesting to get, very kind of niche down on the college campuses. So thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And with that, everybody, have a great Wednesday.